So I'm going to talk about my active process today, which could also be described as my wet media process. Everything that I do once I start getting involved with physical paint on a physical surface. Um, and that generally, for most projects, begins with doing a sketch along the lines of what you can see me working on here. This is a 5x7 piece of Masonite with a red acrylic cadmium red ground, and I'm painting on top of that. You could see in the very beginning here, you could see faint pencil lines where I've kind of placed everything, and then I'm going in with titanium white and lamp black and letting the red show through in parts. But basically just doing a kind of like a value sketch. And that's going to be my guide that I use when I get into doing the full-size piece, which we've jumped to here. For the final piece, I'll then prepare a board with gesso. I like to apply my gesso with a palette knife, and then that gives me some kind of like nice organic ripply textures in there, which are subtle. You probably can't really see them too well in the reproduction, but they add just a little bit of kind of organic texture to everything, and I think they look pretty cool in the actual in-person originals. And then I will project my preliminary onto the full-size board, and using like a mid-tone neutral color, just kind of block in the shapes of everything. And then on top of that, it's basically like a washy monochromatic drawing that I end up with that doesn't get very far outside of the middle tones in terms of light and dark, but it will have some general indications of the value structure. And then on top of that, once that's dry, I'll wash in some basic colors indicating where I intend to go, which some of those steps I didn't manage to save as I was recording this process, but you could see kind of the jump from the sketch to the color wash, which is where the video picked up here. From there, you'll notice my approach to the sketch and to the final are fairly similar in the hierarchy of kind of like what area I begin with, and then where I go to from there and from there and from there until I get to the end of the piece. So right now, I started here with working on the portrait, which is the most important part of most paintings for me. Is if there's a face or a portrait, that is going to be the area that tends to carry the most of the load as far as being a focal point, being an area where a lot of the story is told, and being a part that mostly tends to draw our attention, and where people spend a lot of time looking. And so that's kind of the most critical thing for me, and I like to jump in and just get started with that right from the beginning, and then I can come back to it and poke at it if I want. A lot of the time, as I go forward, I find I might not necessarily need to go back in and do more with it, but starting with it from the beginning lets me really kind of focus my attention on that, and then just kind of keep it in mind as I go forward working on other things. But you can see, again, the sketch, I had a real kind of similar idea as this in the final, but when you're working with color and working at a larger scale, it just is more complex, but not essentially all that different. What I do then is work from the midtone and start pushing my shadows and highlights into place. So, when I've got an area, which I'll get into more detail as we get to one here, but I've got an area that right now is just kind of like a flat kind of, the color is not very intense right now because it's just this thin washy color on top, and then I'll start blocking in a more punchy mid-tone color, and from there find the darker areas and the lighter areas, and just kind of carve out those shapes. In some cases here you can see I'm adding more kind of like an intense chromatic edge to things, and then going in and filling. Like especially you'll see I do that in any areas that are supposed to be like really bright and glowing, or the white parts of his suit. This kind of helps describe what the color is of those areas, but then you also get the real bright brilliance of that kind of blown out highlight core. So in the raised fist on the side here is a good example of this middle tone pushing to dark and light, where it starts kind of soft and fuzzy, and then the more I work into it, the more I'm kind of like carving and cutting up little shadows and getting like harder edges in there, describing that light bit of highlight on the edge of the fist, and then those more kind of chromatic mid-tone reds on the front side of the knuckles and fingers. Going to the gauntlet on the other hand here, I'm laying in these kind of big, flat, dark areas, and a lot of the form is actually kind of described by just those shadows and highlights, but the big flat areas are really kind of like a base that sits on top of. And it doesn't necessarily, like, I really believe in not overdoing the details, kind of letting things be suggested, and trying to be kind of efficient in my brushstrokes and economical in the way that I add detail and kind of areas of interest, not trying to overwhelm it. So when I've got this kind of like flat, darkish mid-tone as a base, and then I'm going in and finding those brighter red highlights inside of that, going in and cutting in those darker shadows and edges between fingers, and describing some of the kind of like the way that this gauntlet has these what appear to be kind of like armored sections to it, using just some choppy little shadow bits to kind of describe edges and things like that. And then it just kind of all of a sudden comes together as a three-dimensional form, and you can see how it's the overall large color and tone is just kind of like a unifying platform that those highlights and shadows sit on top of, that end up kind of giving us this illusion of volume. So as we move through the piece here, as I said, I start with the portrait. Face and hands are always the most kind of expressive and important parts of a figure, and so those are areas that I'm going to give initial and intense attention to. And once I feel like those are fairly well described, then I'll go working into the areas that are adjacent to that usually, and just kind of working my way around from there. Now this kind of connects to the same idea of where I'm putting down that mid-tone base and then finding shadows and highlights as a way of not getting lost in detail and not overstating things, but just kind of being economical and efficient with it. When I spend the early stages working on the really critical stuff, and then feel confident that I have got what I wanted to get out of those areas, then as I start getting into the more kind of like maybe we could say peripheral parts of the figure, or getting into the supporting areas of the picture, getting into the background, getting into some of the kind of like the negative space, I'm less tempted to get carried away overdoing details in those areas, because at that point I can see where I'm at with the focal areas and how much is needed to really kind of sit harmoniously with those focal areas. If I start, and I used to do this years ago, I would do my backgrounds before getting into the focal areas, and I had a habit of maybe spending a little too much time and attention on things that ended up being kind of distracting because they were competing with those focal areas. I like to have a little bit more contrast in resolved and suggested in the final piece now. And so if I start with the areas that are going to be the most resolved, that lets me see how much I can kind of get away with suggesting on the areas that are adjacent to that. Now, painting fire is something that I really love, and I think that part of that is it can be really kind of bent and shaped to complement the composition and to really help move your eye through the piece in a way that very few other things can be done. It's something that is also a light source, so it really adds a lot of drama and influences the other things in the picture. And in this painting, I'm really kind of using that to really kick up the intensity, to kick up the drama of the piece. And when I'm painting fire, I start with a kind of like a warm base, and then I'll go in with these really thin washes of cadmium orange or yellows and reds and things that are going to kind of just add some intense chroma. And again, those will kind of sit around the edges of the bright spots, and in the bright spots I can really get in there with some in the brightest areas some pure titanium white, which is then going to mix into those high chroma cadmium colors. It's something that takes a little bit of practice, because a lot of people will rightly point out that your colors will get chalky when you start adding white into them. So it's really a matter of working with transparency and not adding any more white than is necessary. And then also, if you want to go back in on second layer, third layer when stuff is dry, and adding more transparent glazes of those really intense colors can also really push that effect of that intense orange and yellow that you might want to have in your flames. So at this point, I've put in my lights, put in my shadows. Didn't really need much more than that. Just a little bit of color correction once I've shot the photo of the final, and it's ready to go.